Dr. Mark Giese here with your Science Moment. Where exactly are the dangers of centralized censorship? So, recently, in the last few weeks, the federal government, Biden administration, has been putting together a disinformation bureau to centralize the control and tax on the kinds of disinformation that happens, and presumably misinformation as well, that's happening in the public square, on social networks, and I presume newspapers and everything. Now, usually most of us point out the obvious, and that the danger, and certainly the most obvious danger of that sort of thing, is that you don't want the federal government to have this kind of centralized control of the narrative. Instead, what you want is free expression, which happens by virtue of the entire network of people arguing and having free expression, all the kinds of things we talk about. But I think this somewhat misses the mark in terms of exactly what's dangerous about the federal government having that kind of centralized control. What makes it dangerous isn't so much that the federal government is going to abuse it, which of course they are. I mean, and I'm not necessarily going to say what I'm about to say is more dangerous, but there's another danger that people don't seem to fully understand, and really the role of the government in a situation like that, what happens when they take over control of the narrative and they're trying to stop disinformation, is, well, they're creating it themselves a danger because they can abuse that, but what they're also doing in interfering in the normal functionality of the free expression network, which is just society as a whole, arguing and debating, is that they are preventing it from happening. They are unleashing the dangerous forces of mass hysteria. Because, sure, you can have mass hysteria sweep through like it did in March, when it just happened through. And this wasn't even due to centralized censorship at that point. It just happened just because it swept through and basically, in a fortnight or even in 2 days it happened. But the mechanisms of free expression, with people able to slowly pull together and back up, say, okay, actually here's the data, we shouldn't have been so. All of those things, when they happen, they correct. They correct on their own, self-correct, through the entire network. The danger of centralized control by the federal government is not only that they themselves can abuse it, but they wreck the mechanisms upon which we all rely to engage in the corrective processes to prevent and inhibit these kinds of waves from going through, or to correct them when they do happen. That's what's most dangerous about the censorship that's been happening since, especially since April or so of 2021, what our lawsuit is about. We're worried about the Biden administration, any administration abusing that, but really, when they start stopping the alternative narrative, what they're unleashing is the forces of the populace, bottom-up forces of one half of the population, or some significant portion of the population, to just for that narrative just to move on and slowly spread, because that's the only thing that people are hearing. Governments are part of the community. They're just as likely to fall into mass hysteria as anybody else. And by them controlling it, they become a danger. But when they start controlling the narrative, they are unleashing the forces of unchecked free expression. The way that you check free expression is not through centralized controllers, it's through more free expression from the network, from people who rise and fall in reputation, as we've talked about. And notice that one of the reasons it's important to phrase it this way, and we're going to come back to this later, is that the government is disproportionately dangerous if they can control the narrative compared to other centralized censors. But again, the second reason for worrying about centralized censorship is, again, that it prevents the normal functioning. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's federal government that's the centralized censor, if it's Twitter fact checkers, even if they weren't being controlled by the federal government, if it's Facebook fact checkers, that where the public square, the public accommodation of the public square, where people are saying, no, you're not allowed to talk or say those sorts of things. That kind of centralized censorship is just as dangerous. Twitter may not be able to use their power to, take over and confiscate your money and things like this. But the second danger of centralized censorship applies just as well to Twitter itself and to Facebook and to Amazon and to Google as it does to the federal government. When they're given the power to control the narrative within their space, which is really a public accommodation, it's just a place where you're allowed to speak, As they do that, as they control the narrative and as they censor others, they are preventing the corrective methods that allow us all to slowly find the truth, the equilibrium that is the truth. So we need to focus on the second danger. The second danger is really the big danger of centralized federal censorship, and it's also found in Twitter and Facebook and so on. And so one of the things that we want to do at FreeX, and one of the things that we want to do, with our lawsuit with the new civil liberties, new NCLA, is we want to push back government, but the larger scheme here is to build a kind of both tolerance in the bones of everybody and in the bones of the CEOs and all these big companies, the oligarchs, to understand and also put in real teeth. The law needs to require that all of these public accommodations, period, at the small level and at the large levels, need to not discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. Whether it's at the largest scales of whole Twitter-like gigantic networks or at a restaurant, people cannot, those private companies, sure, but they're public accommodations. They shouldn't be able to discriminate on the basis of political viewpoint. Because when they do, and the bigger they are, the worse it is, again, they prevent the way that society corrects itself and the way that society inhibits unchecked dangerous narratives from flowing through. And that was your science moment.